Well, ladies and gentlemen, I must begin with an apology. Some of you may know that you were supposed to listen to a very distinguished general this evening, but he couldn't make it, and so you will have to make do with a rather tattered former captain in the Singapore Armed Forces Reserves. And as you all are military officers, you would know that is undoubtedly a very low form of life. In the infantry, to boot. And I'm bound to warn you that my eccentric and inconsequential views are only my own, and I speak for nobody but myself tonight. My subject is the major transitions that are occurring in East Asia, and which I believe will have global consequences. It is evident, it's almost a cliche, that the world is undergoing a profound transition of power and ideas. The modern international system was shaped by the West, who prescribed its fundamental concepts, established its basic institutions and practices, and influenced all major developments. While that era is now drawing to a close, no one can predict the future, and we do not know what will replace the Western shaped and dominated system. But we can at least glimpse some of the issues that will have to be confronted going forward. For the last 200 years or so, the core issue confronting Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America was how to adapt to a Western-defined modernity. In fact, the very concept of modernity is Western. Only a handful of countries, almost all in East Asia, has successfully met the challenges. And ironically, this Western-dominated system is now being transformed by the very transformations forced upon these countries by the Western system. Japan led the way after the Meiji Restoration in the 19th century, but China is the most important example. And what made the old system ultimately unsustainable was China's decision to abandon a dysfunctional planned communist economic system, embrace the market, and integrate itself into the international economic grid. And by transforming itself, China transformed the world. Major adjustments, both domestic in key countries and geopolitical, will be necessary. Since China was the catalyst, East Asia finds itself at the epicenter of the changes that are underway. Post-World War II East Asia is largely an American creation. The US provided the stability that was the foundation for decades of growth and prosperity. The most difficult and wrenching adjustments will therefore be between the US and China. And historically, you know, all transitions between one kind of international system to another kind of international system were either the result of conflict or resulted in conflict. And what is now being attempted is unprecedented in world history, to manage a transition without conflict. Well, Washington and Beijing are now groping towards a new modus vivendi. Neither finds it easy, and establishing a new equilibrium will be a work of decades, not just a few years. Sino-US relations are already the most important bilateral relationship in East Asia, setting the tone for the entire region. When they are calm, the region is calm. And when they are royal, the region is extremely anxious. And as the 21st century progresses, I think at least, Sino-US relations will become the most important bilateral relationship for the entire world, influencing almost every aspect of international relations, just as US-Soviet relations did during the Cold War. It's an unfortunate fact, but a reality, that rivalry is an inescapable element in any great power relationship. All great powers are intrinsically revisionist. The only question is to what degree. This is not necessarily by design, but because the rise of major powers disrupts the existing order as an existential fact, irrespective of their intentions. As China grows, it will inevitably become more assertive in pursuit of its interests. The signs are already evident. It's entirely natural. Competition and some degree of tension is between the US and China is thus inevitable. But conflict between the US and China is not inevitable. Unlike during the Cold War in US-Soviet relations, there is no bitter, fundamentally irreconcilable ideological divide between the US and a China that has now enthusiastically embraced the market. The Soviet Union was containable, mainly because it largely contained itself by pursuing autarky. But China is now so vital a part of the world economy, and the interdependence between the US and China is so profound, that the US might as well try to contain itself as try to contain China. And China might as well try to exclude itself from East Asia as try to displace the US. This would be total and utter exercises in futility. Neither the US nor China can achieve their basic national goals without, at least in some degree, working with the other. This is a reality, but it is a reality that neither the US nor China finds particularly comfortable, because this profound interdependence between them coexists with deep strategic mistrust. In fact, distrust. Interdependence, in fact, enhances strategic distrust because it exposes their mutual vulnerabilities. All the more so because China's rise has been psychologically disquieting to many in the West. China and some other East Asian countries are regarded as fundamentally challenging the Western historical narrative because in East Asia, and above all in China, the market economy and capitalism flourishes without liberal democracy. And this is somehow regarded as unnatural. Now, this is a view that ignores an inconvenient historical fact. And the historical fact is this: every Western country was capitalist long before it was either liberal or democratic. The form of democracy that developed in the West was the result of highly contingent historical processes that there is absolutely no reason to expect will be replicated anywhere else. But the perceived anomaly resonates with deep Western anxieties about its place in this changing world, because China, unlike, for example, Japan or India, China only wants to be China and not an honorary member of the West. The Chinese experience punctures the Western myth of universality. This is a mode of thought that has its origins, I think at least, in monotheistic Christian traditions, and is today deeply embedded in even the most secular Western societies. It lies at the heart of the Western sense of self. Yet it is only a myth. I mean, look around you. All our senses tell us that diversity is an empirical fact. Curiously, diversity is celebrated by liberal thought in domestic contexts, but denigrated internationally. A Western-defined universality could only be imposed in defiance of reality by Western power and a dominance that is now ebbing. Of course, all societies, all cultures hold some values in common. That is not the issue. But what they hold in common are at such a high level of generality that they have little practical significance for how different societies govern or organize themselves. Think about your own countries. So except for today, except for a handful of countries, mainly in the Middle East and one in Southeast Asia, every polity now legitimates itself by some variant of the 18th century Western political philosophy that holds that sovereignty derives from the will of the people. Derives from the will of the people rather than divine right or bloodline or some other principle. And this is the fundamental basis of democracy, that sovereignty resides in the will of the people. Yet it is evident, for example, that Japanese democracy is not the same as American democracy, and American democracy is not the same as the different varieties of European democracy. And Japanese democracy is different from democracy that is practiced in other Asian countries, for example, South Korea or Indonesia or Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia. But all democracies, or all countries that call themselves democracies, ultimately validate themselves by the same 18th century political philosophy. Even the people's democracies of China and Vietnam share the same intellectual roots. None is perfect, of course. But I tend to believe there is no perfection to be found this side of heaven, and I don't particularly believe in heaven, so there's no perfection to be found anywhere. But at least the theory they profess is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. And these are not, as you practical military men may think, these are not just abstract considerations, because since the end of the Cold War, the claim of universality in one form or another, the claim of universality of certain principles, certain political forms, has been used to justify Western interventions to change regimes in North Africa and the Middle East. Now, you all know that all of these interventions have not turned out particularly well. All of these interventions have only resulted in greater instability, but this has not forced any change of Western rhetoric, at least about universality. Even if this particularly stupid rhetoric or stupid talk about the end of history. You remember that? Even this stupid talk about the end of history has now been quietly smothered in an embarrassed silence. And prudence, fortunately, prudence has ensured that military intervention in the name of universality has only been deployed against the small and the weak. This has tempered but has not erased anxieties that this approach has aroused in many countries, including China. And not all interventions are necessarily military. They are not all kinetic interventions. East Asia, Singapore included, has experienced perhaps more than our fair share of Western meddling in our internal affairs. Political meddling, I mean. This is an addiction. This propensity to meddle, this is an addiction that many in the West do not seem to be able to shake off. Recently, I was rather bemused to read that some British parliamentarians were thinking of visiting Hong Kong to check up on the city's democratization. And I thought this was really the acme of presumption. Why? Because the British ruled Hong Kong for 156 years as a colony, not a democracy. To the British, the Hong Kong people were subjects, and that very word says it all. They were subjects, not citizens. But this example, which I came across as I was preparing for this event, is only a very minor example of no particular consequence, except to make the British look more hypocritical than usual. Unfortunately, however, not all manifestations of this habit are so harmlessly amusing. Western leaders often posture for domestic audiences or to preserve their own sense of armor prop, to preserve their own sense of self-esteem. But they do not sufficiently understand that words have strategic consequences. The Chinese leadership is deeply concerned about maintaining internal stability, which they equate with preserving the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. And history, their very long history, has taught the Chinese leadership to fear most those historical periods, such as they and we all are now experiencing, when internal unrest, internal disquiet, coincides with external uncertainty. Now, communism is a bankrupt ideology. I don't think anybody outside maybe Cambridge, Massachusetts, who believes in communism anymore. So, with communism a bankrupt ideology, the Communist Party of China emphasizes nationalism and economic growth to legitimize its rule. But rapid growth inevitably raises social tensions, and nationalism is a double-edged sword that the Chinese Communist Party knows can easily turn against itself. And the Chinese Communist Party is engaged in a very delicate balancing act, the continuation of which depends on the success of the new stage of very ambitious reforms, very necessary but very ambitious reforms, announced last year at the third plenum in November last year. Now, I don't think China will ever become a multi-party system on the Western model, but Chinese politics is becoming more normal. More normal. The days are long past when any Chinese leader, however powerful, can simply command. The Chinese system has become more pluralist, with competing institutional and regional interests, among other kinds of interests, to be brokered in the context of a public opinion, easily inflamed and aroused through social media. China has 500 million netizens. How many of our countries have 500 million citizens? Unfortunately, in the 21st century, normal politics is also all too often dysfunctional politics. This is a global phenomenon caused by the collision of the 18th century notion of the sovereignty of the people with the 21st century communications technologies. Internet-based social media conflates the idea of the people with the views of individuals or small groups. Who are the people on the internet? Do you know? I don't know. It conflates the views, the idea of the people with small groups, with individuals even sometimes. It confuses fact with opinion. I mean, all of you must have had young people under your command. What is their first, if you ask them to go and look up something, what is their first instinct? Go and Google it. Was everything on the internet always correct? Or Wikipedia, is it always correct? Of course not. Fact and opinion have become confused. And it devalues expertise. Because why go and study for years to learn about something when you can Google it? And it sets up, and all these factors set up dynamics that make governance more difficult. And it remains to be seen how the Communist Party of China will cope. Under these very challenging circumstances, and besides, and by the way, all of our countries, in some degree, mine included, is facing this challenge. Under these very challenging circumstances, the Chinese leadership can be forgiven for regarding Western attitudes towards universality with grave suspicion. It is significant that the new model of international great power relations that China has proposed to the US has respect for core interests as a central theme. And certainly preservation of the Chinese Communist Party's rule must be a core interest. And who is to say that this is wrong? Political reform is difficult in any system. And given the traumatic experience of the former Soviet Union, and I emphasize the word former, which the Chinese have studied very carefully, given the traumatic experience of the former Soviet Union, under Gorbachev's ill-considered reforms, Chinese leaders are correct to be very cautious about political reform. It is not self-evident that a multi-party system is optimal for a country of the size and complexity of China. A failed China will destabilize not just East Asia, but the entire world. And this will be in no country's interest. At the same time, China's leaders must understand that their own words and actions also have strategic consequences too. If a successful, peaceful transition requires the West to abandon a very pretentious liberal democratic universality and admit that different political systems have their own legitimacy and their own intellectual validity, it also requires China to resist the temptations of a triumphalist nationalism. This is particularly so because far more than other nationalisms, contemporary Chinese nationalism is outwardly directed. Chinese nationalism is today focused on Japan. The Chinese public, including those 500 million netizens, is fed a steady diet of movies, TV dramas, documentaries, publications, keeping alive and fanning bitter memories of the Second World War and Japanese atrocities in China. But it was not always so. On at least 2 occasions, to a Japanese socialist group in 1964 and to then Prime Minister Tanaka Kakue in 1972, no less a person than Mao Zedong himself, brushed aside apologies for Japan's wartime record in China because, as Mao then said, it was with the help of the Japanese invasion that the Chinese Communist Party was victorious. And in 1971, Mao told President Nixon much the same thing. The Chinese Communist Party then based its primary claim to legitimacy on class struggle, and it emphasized its defeat of the Kuomintang more than Japan. What the hell is happening? Oh, well. You can hear me, right? Despite this. Well, the Chinese Communist Party then based its primary claim to legitimacy on class struggle, and it emphasized its defeat of the Kuomintang more than Japan. But once China embraced the market economy, this was no longer sustainable. The market, class struggle, these are not compatible concepts. And once the Chinese Communist Party in 2002 decided to allow businessmen working in private enterprises, that's capitalist by any other name, to join the Chinese Communist Party, class struggle lacked any credibility as a claim to legitimacy. But as nominal communists, the Chinese Communist Party cannot focus Chinese nationalism internally on China's long and glorious history. Because if the imperial past was so glorious, why have a revolution? And the Chinese Communist Party's attitude towards its own revolutionary history, and such episodes as the famine caused by ill-considered policies like the Great Leap Forward, and the many lives lost or wrecked by the Cultural Revolution, and indeed towards Mao Zedong himself, is ambivalent. Chinese nationalism has to be primarily directed outwards, lest awkward questions be asked internally about the Chinese Communist Party itself. Now, don't misunderstand me. There is no doubt that Japan behaved with great brutality during the Second World War, not just in China, but in Southeast Asia. But keeping alive bitter memories when most of East Asia, except Korea, to some degree, has moved forward, conscribes China's own room for maneuver and complicates the already complicated adjustments with the US, which is Japan's principal ally, that are necessary for a peaceful transition. And virulent nationalism casts a shadow over relations with the smaller countries around China's periphery, where the sheer disparity of size and economic weight already causes anxieties. It risks polarizing a region in which some Chinese actions in the East and South China Seas have led several countries to seek a closer relationship with the US. There is a very ancient Chinese tradition that stresses the importance of the rectification of names. It's a Confucian tradition. Names are very important because wrong words can lead to wrong deeds and risk making China's most serious concerns a reality. And a more robust American posture in the South China Sea is already manifest and welcomed by many countries in the region. Now, we have no position on the various claims in the South China Sea or the East China Sea or any sea for that matter except our own, which is rather small. And it's entirely natural that any country will defend what it considers its sovereign rights. It is also entirely natural that any country will want the best military force that it can afford, because the ability to defend oneself is a vital attribute of sovereignty. And so I find nothing unusual in Chinese maritime claims in the East and South China Seas or in China's military modernization program. Nothing unusual at all. But what is critical here is how a country defends its sovereignty, its claims of sovereignty, and what use it makes of its military force. Will claims of sovereignty be pursued within common frameworks or norms, including procedural norms to change norms regarded as obsolete or unjust, and some norms are obsolete and unjust, or will they be pursued by unilateral actions based on superior force? And it is this more than any other single factor that will determine whether the China dream will become the region's nightmare. The record is mixed, and China has not behaved consistently. I can give you examples later if you like. Great powers have a responsibility to reassure that China is only partly fulfilled. Now, every Chinese school child knows of the 100 years of humiliation that China suffered. And the Chinese Communist Party is the latest iteration in a history of experimentation that began with the self-strengthening movements of the 19th century. And since the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, the Chinese have tried a variety of experiments. They've tried republicanism, they've tried communism, and now they tried the market economy in search of wealth and power to preserve China from foreign predations. And this history has made the Chinese Communist Party a highly adaptive organization, which, unlike the former Communist Party of the Soviet Union, is not led by leaders in denial, but is led by very competent and rigorously tested cadres with a clinical appreciation of China's challenges. But all the more so, the mentality and pose of a victim ill suits a great power. It was never very realistic to expect China to be a responsible stakeholder, and you know the phrase is credited to Bob Zoellick. Never realistic to expect China to be a responsible stakeholder in a regional and global order that it had no say in establishing, and which it holds responsible for a century of humiliation. It is natural, entirely natural, for any rising power to want to revise an order to better reflect its own interests. And the US and its friends and allies in East Asia have to accept this new reality. No status quo is ever static, and nothing lasts forever. At the same time, however, the current regional and global order has not been entirely unfavorable to China, and at least over the last 3 decades or so, has facilitated China's rise. So there is no compelling reason, no compelling immediate reason for China to kick over the table and seek radical revisions of the status quo. So setting aside the sovereignty disputes, what is most problematic is not that China is revisionist. It is that China is still overall a global free rider on a system whose original creators and beneficiaries cannot now afford to maintain without help. The question that cannot now be answered is what price the West, and in particular the US, will be prepared to pay for help. And indeed, the Chinese themselves probably have not yet entirely decided what price to ask and to ask for what. And this may explain the many uncertainties of this transition period and the inconsistency of Chinese foreign policy pulled this way and that way by contradictory imperatives and the vagaries of domestic opinion no longer under control and which Chinese leaders both fear and use. Now that said, sovereignty disputes do have a special resonance and arouse special sensitivities. Something happened earlier this year that most of you may not have noticed. In February this year, President Xi Jinping met Lian Chan, the former Taiwanese premier and vice president, in what was hailed as the highest level exchange between the People's Republic of China and Taiwan since Mao Zedong met Chiang Kai-shek in 1945. And in a speech on that occasion, the People's Daily published on its front page under the title, "The Chinese Dream to Fulfill the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese People Together." President Xi cast the meeting in the historical context of how Taiwan had been occupied by foreign powers when the Chinese nation had been weak in the past. Now, the speech was specific to Taiwan, obviously because it's meeting Lian Chan. The speech was specific to Taiwan, but by casting reconciliation with Taiwan as an instance of the rectification of the many historical injustices done to a weak China, it suggested and left open a broader settling of accounts. China is increasingly defining its claims in the East and South China Seas in terms of its historical rights. And this is bound to raise anxiety levels even if China does not mean it in the same way as Taiwan. Taiwan is special, I understand that. China has pledged that its development will be peaceful, and it has carefully studied the experiences of Germany and Japan to avoid the mistakes that led both those countries to disaster. And there's no reason to disbelieve that China is sincere about its peaceful development. Chinese leaders know that a conflict with the US can in all probability only have one outcome. And even a stalemate will risk the Communist Party's hold on power. In international law, history has a role in claims over territory, over land territory, but not over maritime claims, not since UNCLOS anyway. And history alone is not an appropriate criterion to settle sovereignty disputes because history is always subject to multiple interpretations, and interpretations is always subject to constant revisions as new facts come to light and interests change. But sometimes I think China's leaders seem trapped by their own narratives. Now, the Chinese government and people are rightly proud of what they have achieved in the last few years. Never before in human history have so many people been lifted out of poverty in so short a time. Still, it would be a very dangerous mistake to try to define the complex global and regional transitions that are underway simplistically. And some Chinese intellectuals and even some officials that I have met occasionally come perilously close to boasting that, China is rising, the West is declining. But the changes in the distribution of global power that are occurring are relative. They are not absolute. The global patterns of trade, finance, investments, the global production chains that have evolved as a result of East Asia growth cannot be characterized by geographically defined dichotomies. Many economic roads now pass through East Asia and China specifically, and many more will in the future. Nevertheless, the final destination is still and will remain, I think, for quite a long time. The final destination is more often than not the US or Europe. And China is certainly rising, but it is always a mistake to believe one's own propaganda, and the West, and in particular the US, is not in decline. All who have underestimated American resolve, American creativity, American resilience, have had cause to regret it. Anyway, the East Asia that is growing is in any case an East Asia that has been profoundly influenced by contacts with the West. As I alluded to at the beginning, the most successful East Asian countries, China included, are those who have most thoroughly adapted to a Western defined modernity. And this has enabled some of us, China included, to so-called leave Asia, as was the ambition for Japan of a gentleman called Fukuzawa Yukichi, a Meiji-era reformer. And of course, this does not mean that any of us must mindlessly replicate without any modification Western institutions or mindlessly and uncritically adapt Western ideologies or sacrifice our core cultural identities. In any case, the meaning of what we understand to be the West is evolving under the pressures of a growing East Asia. China's rise is forcing a reappraisal of the way Western countries approach issues like Tibet or Taiwan, particularly in those European countries that now look to China with their cap in their hand because they need the money. In a very tentative and yet incoherent manner, the internal structural changes imposed by the new world economy is even forcing some in the West to ask themselves if liberal values taken to extremes have not become self-subverting. Question worth thinking about anyway. We have all changed. I, for one, do not believe there can be any clash of civilizations because there is no traditional civilization that exists anywhere except maybe on the inconsequential periphery. And it's not as if a Western system will be suddenly and cataclysmically displaced by a so-called Asian system. What is happening is something more subtle and more difficult to define. A multi-dimensional process of social, economic, political, and cultural metamorphosis has been underway and gathering force in East Asia since the Meiji Restoration. The road has not been smooth, and there will be certainly many unpredictable twists and turns yet to come that cannot be predicted. But the trajectory is set. And once the metamorphosis is complete, there will be a new hybrid, and that's to say, a new system. How long this will take, what specific institutional forms it will take, what collateral damage may be incurred along the way, and what the ultimate implications will be for international relations, no one can now say with any certainty. But in East Asia, it has already made the strategic environment more complex and more unpredictable. The tensions over maritime claims are obvious symptoms, but these issues will not be the only or the most serious manifestations of the new strategic complexities. US-China relations, as I mentioned, will be at the center of the necessary adjustments and complexities, but Sino-Japanese relations, Japan-Korea relations, Sino-Indian relations also require adjustments, and all of them are sensitive, replete with ambushes laid by their long and complexly interwoven histories. And Southeast Asia too has its own complexities that require careful management because there are no obvious solutions. And there are no easy solutions. But if there is one factor that distinguishes East Asia from all other non-Western regions, it is East Asia's commitment to growth. Of course, I know all countries in every region profess growth as a priority. But it has been my experience, at least, that few really mean it. But in East Asia, with the exception of North Korea, growth, far more than any other abstract political theory, is the primary means by which governments legitimate their rule and manifest this idea of the sovereignty of the people. Now, this does not guarantee peace, but East Asian governments at least have a strong self-interest to minimize actions that would disrupt growth. And I take comfort in the fact that self-interest is the most sincere form of interest. So the primary risk in this region is conflict by inadvertence, by accident, and not war by design. But this is not a risk that can be discounted. And recent actions by claimant states, all claimant states, in the East and South China Seas have increased the probability of accidents. And this underscores the continuing critical importance of the US presence to maintain stability, because nothing can replace it. China is not ready, doesn't quite have the capability, and even if it were to acquire the capability, it's not entirely clear that it would be in China's interest to do so, to try to displace the US entirely. Because without a strong US presence in East Asia and a credible alliance with the US, Japan would well become a nuclear weapon state. It certainly has the capability to do so very quickly. And if Japan goes nuclear, will South Korea sit idly by and sort of wring its hands in despair? I don't think so. The complexities and risks would multiply. But at the same time, while there's recognition of the either overt or tacitly of the importance or the irreplaceability of the US presence, there is a consensus across East Asia, including among US friends and allies, that some new architecture is needed to supplement the US presence to maintain stability. In other words, the US presence is now a necessary but no longer sufficient condition to maintain stability. Now, this broad consensus does not in itself prescribe a solution, and the debate over a new East Asian architecture reflects the stresses and rivalries that it seeks to mitigate. Many of these fault lines converge in Southeast Asia, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, finds itself at the center of this debate, subject to multiple pressures from major powers. At present, there are two main competing visions of regional order that are in play. There is a Sino-centric vision built around the ASEAN Plus 3 Forum, or APT, and this is a forum which comprises the 10 Southeast Asian members of ASEAN, with China, Japan, and South Korea. And the other vision is built around a much more broader and more open architecture built around the East Asian Summit, or EAS, which is all the members of the APT, with the addition of the US, Russia, India, Australia, and New Zealand. Well, given the growing centrality of East Asia in the world economy and the strategic weight of the US and China, the outcome of this debate over a new East Asian architecture will be the single most important influence on the global architecture of the 21st century. And this is the strategic significance of what has been dismissed by Western observers, who I often suspect, in fact I know, often do not really understand what they observe as talk shops, the APT or the ES. Well, no option has yet been foreclosed. Both the APT and ES are ongoing experiments, and there may well be other experiments to come. And the choices are not necessarily just binary, A or B. A multi-layered system of overlapping old architectures and new frameworks may well be the architecture more suited to the diversity of East Asia and perhaps more resilient than a single structure that could prove brittle when subject to shocks. And certainly, I will make my preference and my bias clear. Certainly such a multiple overlapping system seems to me to be one in which the smaller countries of East Asia, mine included, can best preserve their autonomy. Thank you for listening to me. I've probably spoken too long, and now I think I will take some of your questions.